The town had a name for Stephen Cole's new doorway. They called it the Hole. A man had to be either a genius or a fool to dig his own front step 2 feet below the floor.
You're gonna break your own ankle one morning, Cole. Or worse, somebody else's. Cold air sinks. It'll pool down there instead of pouring into the room. That's not how houses work. You want the cold out, you build a good door and seal it tight. This is sealed, just in a different way.
Paul Harrison shook his head and turned to the small crowd that had gathered.
Man's dug a pit trap for the winter. First hard freeze. That thing'll fill with ice, and he'll be trapped inside his own house. It's not a trap, it's a cold sink.
And with that, Stephen turned back to his cabin, Rivers padding after him. The air inside was still warm. No one in that crowd believed him. But the cold had not yet fallen. That evening, Paul returned to Stephen's door, his breath pluming thick and fast in the porch light.
You really believe that hole's going to keep you warm? Cold is heavy. It will sink into the pit instead of rising into the room. Then why hasn't anyone else done it?
Stephen closed the door and returned to the fire.
Cold sinks. I've never heard such foolishness.
But the floor was already cold under his boots, a chill creeping up through the boards. Ice webbed across the window panes, each crystalline feather a silent argument. In his cabin, Stephen added a final log to the fire. Rivers dozed on the upper floor, warm and untroubled, while the pit below waited. And as the firelight flickered, the cold began its silent, patient descent into the pit. Morning arrived, bright and brittle. In Stephen's cabin, the fire had burned low, but the upper floor held its warmth like a blanket tucked close.
My floor is frozen solid. That's never happened before.
Frost had climbed the baseboards like a slow white mold, and the door might as well have been left open. He pulled on his boots and went to Stephen Cole's cabin, anger nipping at his heels.
Cole, open the door. My floor's an ice sheet, and I want to know why yours isn't. You saw the pit. The cold air drains down there. It can't climb back up. Air moves. It doesn't just sit in a hole because you tell it to. Come inside and feel it for yourself. Put your hand over the pit. This proves nothing. A warm cabin can happen by chance.
He left without another word, but the doubt had been planted, and the winter was only starting to show its teeth. Days passed, and the cold only tightened its grip. In Stephen's cabin, the fire crackled, and Rivers never strayed from the warm upper floor. But in Paul's, the frost grew thicker, and he woke each morning to find his breath hanging in the air.
He's lucky, that's all. A warm spell will show his pit's useless.
And then the wind shifted. A warm front rolled over the mountains, and the snow began to soften. By noon, water dripped from the eaves, and the yard turned to slush. Paul watched the melt and thought, this is it. The pit will flood and his floor will be soaked.
That hole will turn into a pond. Then we'll see how smart his cold sink is.
He stomped through the slush toward Stephen's cabin, ready to see the damage. But when he arrived, the pit was not a pond. The meltwater had collected there, true, but the upper floor remained dry.
This doesn't make sense. Maybe. No. It's just the way the ground slopes. The whole yard is slush, but your floor is bone dry. How? Come inside. I'll show you something I learned years ago.
Inside, the cabin was warm and quiet. Rivers slept on the raised hearth, undisturbed.
An old trapper taught me this, back when I was still learning the woods.
He spoke of a man who built his shelter into a hillside, digging a trench at the door.
Cold settles low. He showed me how smoke from his pipe would drift down into the pit. Stories from an old trapper. That's not proof. It's proof that worked for him, and it's working now.
Paul said nothing, but his eyes fell to the dark pool in the pit. The meltwater had not yet frozen again. In the silence, the drip of melting snow was the only answer. Paul returned to his own cabin, the slush soaking through his boots. Inside, puddles spread across the floorboards, reflecting the gray light from the windows.
This is different. The ground here is lower. It has nothing to do with Cole's pit.
But as he mopped, he couldn't shake the memory of the dry upper floor in Stephen's cabin. Later that afternoon, Stephen appeared at his door.
Your floor's wet. My pit's been collecting the melt too, not just cold air. Doesn't prove anything. A drain is a drain. It proves that water follows the same rule as cold. It sinks. He's stretching the facts. A wet floor is inconvenient, not a theory.
But the seed of doubt was now a splinter, and every cold draft in Paul's cabin reminded him of it. The following morning, Paul struck out toward the old growth beyond the settlement, a nagging curiosity pulling him off the beaten path. There, half buried in a hillside, he found a root cellar. The entrance was sunken 2 steps into the earth.
This is the same. No older, but the same cold pool at the bottom.
He struck a match and climbed down. The air inside was still and cold, but the raised shelves were dry.
It's just how root cellars are built, to keep vegetables cool, not for living.
But the design was unmistakable. Stone steps down into a pit, a raised floor for storage above.
Old-timers knew how to store food. That's all. It doesn't mean Cole's Hole is anything more.
He stayed there longer than he intended, the cold from the pit seeping into his bones.
Coincidence. The woods are full of old tricks that don't apply anymore.
When he finally left, the image of that sunken entrance followed him home like a second shadow. That night, Paul sat before a meager fire, but his mind was not in the room. The image of the sunken cellar entrance kept surfacing like a trapdoor in memory.
It's just an old root cellar. The hills are full of them. It doesn't prove anything.
But try as he might, he couldn't unsee the raised floor, the dry shelves, the cold pool at the bottom.
If I admit Stephen's right, I'll never live it down. The whole settlement will say I was a fool.
Before he could push the thought away, a knock came at the door. A neighbor, breathless, delivered the warning. A blizzard was sweeping down the ridge.
Just what I need. Another night of freezing in my own home. Cole's pit must be full of cold by now, but his floor is dry.
He hauled in extra wood and stuffed rags under every crack, but the cold already seeped through the walls like water through a sieve.
The pit works. I've seen it, but that doesn't mean I have to say it out loud.
Then the wind hit, and the cabin groaned under the first heavy gust. The blizzard had arrived. Frost spread across the floor in minutes. Paul stood shivering, and for the first time, he truly imagined what it was like inside Stephen Cole's cabin. The blizzard howled, shaking the cabin walls. Paul's fire was no match. Frost spread faster than he could stomp it away.
I can't last the night. Another hour and my fingers won't move.
He fumbled into his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and braced himself against the door.
Cole's cabin. It'll be warm there. I don't have to believe him. I just have to survive.
He pushed out into the void. Snow lashed his face, and the wind swallowed all sound.
The tree line. Follow it. Don't stop. Don't look back.
The cold sank into his bones, but the thought of Stephen's dry floor and steady fire kept him moving. Through the blinding white, a faint amber glow flickered ahead. Stephen's cabin.
Of course, his house is the one with a light. Just my luck.
He stumbled toward the sunken entrance, the pit dark and deep, awaiting its own purpose. Paul descended the 2 steps into the cold pit, but before he could knock, the door swung open, spilling amber light into the storm.
Get inside. You are frozen through.
Paul stumbled across the threshold. The heat from the fire wrapped around him like a blanket. Rivers raised his head from the warm upper floor, then settled back, unbothered.
This is nothing like my cabin. The floor is warm. My boots are already drying.
Stephen pulled a chair near the fire and gestured Paul toward it.
Sit. The pit's doing its job tonight. Cold stays down there.
Paul glanced back at the sunken entrance. The dark pool of cold air was visible, a blue-black layer just below the floor level.
He was right. It's exactly like the root cellar. Cold sunk down, and we're sitting above it.
For a long moment, Paul said nothing. The blizzard's howl, a distant echo, but his silence was no longer mockery.
The old trapper who told me about the pit. He didn't invent it. He learned it from a Lakota elder, years before I was born.
Stephen leaned forward, his voice low, the storm outside a distant moan.
The elder showed me a shelter he built when he was young. Steps down into the earth, the sleeping platform raised high. Cold air, he said, is like water. It seeks the lowest place.
The image of that hillside shelter, carved from the earth itself, hung in the air between them.
He didn't call it a cold trap. He called it the way of keeping warmth. His people had done it for generations.
Rivers stirred, then settled again, his thick fur rising and falling in the warmth.
Generations, not some fluke. This goes deeper than a trapper's trick. When I built this place, I remembered his words. The cold is not your enemy if you give it a bed.
A log cracked in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney. Paul stared into the fire, saying nothing, but his hands, which had been clenched in his lap, slowly relaxed. The blizzard battered the window, but inside the silence was thick. Paul rose slowly and stepped toward the sunken entrance.
I have to feel the boundary myself, not just see it.
He lowered his hand into the pit. The temperature dropped at his fingertips like a knife edge.
An inch lower, and it's freezing, but my wrist is still warm.
He pushed deeper. The cold bit into his skin, but just above his knuckles. The air was dry and warm.
Two worlds separated by a step. It's not a theory anymore.
He stared at his hand, flexing the cold fingers, then looked back at the pit. The truth was under his skin. Stephen watched from his chair, saying nothing. He had said enough.
All the proof is here, in this cabin. But saying it out loud, that's a different kind of cold.
The storm rattled the walls, but inside, the battle was nearly over. Not with Stephen, with himself. By morning, the blizzard had spent its fury. The world outside was buried in a thick white silence. Paul pulled on his stiff coat and stepped out of Stephen's cabin. The sunken pit was nearly hidden by snowdrift, but the cold air still pooled below. He trudged back to his own place, expecting the worst. Inside, the floor was a sheet of ice. Frost covered every surface. The damage was done.
This cabin fought the cold and lost. Stephen's cabin didn't fight at all. It just let the cold sink away. That root cellar, it wasn't just for vegetables. Someone built it to keep the cold down. It's the same principle. It was already old when the settlers found it. Generations before that, Stephen just remembered what everyone else forgot.
He stood in the frozen ruin of his home and felt the weight of his own stubbornness.
I told the whole settlement he was a fool. Now I am the one standing in ice.
And in that cold, bitter silence, Paul Harrison finally knew what he had to do. He left the frozen cabin and retraced his steps to the old hillside. The snow deep, but the morning clear.
I need to see it with fresh eyes. Not as a coincidence, but as proof.
Inside, the air was still and cold, but the design was laid bare now, every detail illuminated by his lantern.
The raised floor, the pit, every inch copied from the same wisdom. But there has to be something more.
He searched the crevices, and behind a loose stone, he found a folded leather pouch. Inside, a brittle piece of hide, charred at the edges, with a crude but unmistakable drawing. Steps down, a raised sleeping platform, arrows showing cold air sinking.
Not just a root cellar, a shelter. The cold trap was meant for people. They left this as a record. Someone, long ago, knew what Stephen knows now.
He held the drawing in the lantern light, the truth no longer a doubt but a weight.
I can't keep this to myself. But first, I have to face the man I called a fool.
He tucked the fragile leather pouch into his coat and stepped out of the root cellar. The trek back to the settlement was a long one, and his thoughts were louder than the crunch of snow.
I could just bury this. No one else knows about the drawing. I could fix my floor and say nothing. But the cold will come again. Half the families here freeze every winter. Keeping quiet means letting them suffer.
He stopped on a ridge overlooking the settlement, the cabin small and dark against the snow.
That's the real cost of my pride. Not my floor. Every floor. Stephen's way could save them all.
The hide drawing was a weight against his chest, but it was no longer a burden. It was a duty.
I called him a fool in front of everyone. Now I have to stand in front of them again and say I was wrong. But if an elder can carve this wisdom into stone, I can swallow my pride long enough to speak it.
He descended the ridge, his path clear. Not toward his own frozen cabin, but toward Stephen's door. The path ended at Stephen's door. The sunken entrance lay before Paul, cold air pooling at the bottom. He could feel the drawing pressed against his chest.
This is the moment. Just knock. Say what needs to be said.
He raised his hand to the wooden door, then paused, his knuckles an inch from the grain.
Once I knock, everything changes. No taking it back.
A deep breath. Then 3 solid knocks echoed across the quiet snow. Inside, Rivers lifted his head from the warm floor, and Stephen's footsteps crossed the room. The door swung open, and warm amber light spilled onto the cold steps, washing over Paul's face. Paul and Stephen stood face to face, the past hanging between them like the cold air in the pit. The words were there, hard and tight, but for a moment, all he could do was stand in the warmth and remember the ice. Then Paul exhaled, and the weight of all his stubbornness seemed to settle in his chest, ready to be lifted. Paul pulled off his fur hat and held it to his chest, a gesture of surrender.
I was wrong, Cole, about the pit, about all of it. There's an old root cellar beyond the ridge, sunken entrance, just like yours. I found this inside.
He held out the brittle piece of hide, the ancient sketch of a cold sink visible in the fading light.
You found this in that old cellar behind a stone. The same cold sink drawn by people who lived here long before us.
Stephen took the hide, his rough fingers tracing the symbols of the pit and raised floor.
You had the courage to come here and say this. That matters more than the mistake.
A long pause. Then Stephen extended his hand. Paul gripped it, and the cold pit below them seemed just a little less deep. The next morning, Paul stood in the center of the settlement. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the urgency in his voice.
I need to say this before all of you. I was wrong about Stephen Cole's pit. It traps the cold, keeps the living floor dry. I saw it survive a blizzard while my own cabin froze.
He held up the ancient hide, drawing, the crude symbols of a sunken entrance and raised floor visible to all.
He's telling the truth. I've seen the cellar myself. The design is older than any of us. I mocked him in front of you. Now I owe it to everyone to speak the truth. This pit saves lives.
A murmur ran through the group. Then 2 men stepped forward, asking Paul to show them the root cellar. Before the sun was high, a small party followed Paul through the snow to see the ancient entrance for themselves. By evening, a family had already marked out a pit beside their cabin. The design was spreading. Not everyone believed, but the ice in Paul's own floor was argument enough. The cold sink had found its voice. That evening, Stephen Cole sat by his fire, Rivers resting his head on his knee. The cabin was quiet.
All those weeks of being called a fool, they don't sting anymore.
He thought of the old trapper who first showed him the cold sinking from a pipe. The memory was a warm thing now.
He said cold is like water. It seeks the lowest place. That simple truth was written in stone long before us.
He glanced toward the sunken entrance. The cold pool was a dark, still mirror now, reflecting the firelight. Outside, the settlement was dotted with lamplight. A few cabins already had the beginnings of sunken pits.
They're building them now. Paul's making sure of it.
The old hide drawing lay on the mantel, its charcoal lines a bridge across time, wisdom that refused to be forgotten.
The cold doesn't win forever, not when you give it a bed.
Rivers nudged his hand, and Stephen gave the dog a quiet pat. The fire crackled on into the deepening night. By the next morning, Paul Harrison had a shovel in his hand outside his own frozen cabin. The ground was hard, but his resolve was harder.
I am digging my own cold sink. Any man who wants to learn is welcome to pick up a shovel.
A handful of men stepped forward, their own floors still icy. The rhythm of shovels soon filled the air.
2 feet deep. The cold needs space to settle, just like water.
By midday, the pit was framed with wooden boards, the steps taking shape beneath the frost line.
A month ago, I called this a trap. Now I am building one with my own hands.
By dusk, the sunken entrance was ready. The raised floor inside had been relaid, and the pit awaited its first cold test.
It's not Cole's design anymore. It belongs to anyone who needs to stay warm.
As the temperature dropped with the setting sun, a faint blue haze gathered at the bottom of the new pit, the cold finding its bed. Paul Harrison, the loudest skeptic in the valley, had become the builder. The cold trap had taken root not just in the ground, but in the heart of the settlement. Before the week was out, 4 more cabins had sunken entrances. The sound of shovels had become as common as the wind. When the first bitter night came, the new pits filled with a silent blue haze, while the upper floors stayed dry and warm.
It's not just my design anymore. It's the settlement's way now.
Paul and Stephen stood together on a ridge, watching the smoke rise from the transformed settlement below.
You were patient when I gave you nothing but stubbornness. Stubbornness has its uses. It built the first pit after mine.
Before the winter was out, travelers from other valleys came to see the cold sink, carrying the idea further across the mountains. The old hide drawing, now kept in the meeting hall, served as a reminder that some wisdom doesn't need invention, only memory.
The cold still falls, but we finally learned to give it a proper bed.
And in that small mountain settlement, a man dug his doorway below the floor, and the cold fell in. Exactly as it should. As years passed, the sunken entrances became as much a part of the settlement as the pines themselves. Newcomers would ask about the strange pits, and the old-timers would simply say, "Cold sinks down." Stephen Cole's original cold sink still performed its duty, the blue pool never failing. The warm amber light spilling from his door was a permanent invitation to the physics that saved them. Rivers, gray and slow now, always chose the top step, the warmest spot in the valley. The image of the two-tone entrance became the lasting symbol of the settlement's wisdom. No plaque, no monument, just a hole in the ground that held the cold at bay. And on winter nights, when the wind howled and the snow piled high, the cabins stayed warm, because a man once dug his doorway below the floor and the cold fell in, and it always will.